I sailed north in 1903 aboard the steam-assisted whaler Resolute into the pack ice of Svalbard, expecting the ordinary risks of hard work and hungry whales. What trailed our ship at night unsettled every chart and superstition I carried. The wake behind us grew into something that did not belong to sea or animal, and the men began to whisper warnings they had not spoken before. We left Tromsø in June 1903 aboard the schooner Resolute, 20 men and 2 harpoon boats ready for the bowhead season, with sextant and chronometer in the binnacle and casks of salted provisions and whale oil stowed below. Our objective was simple and mercantile: to find the lead lines and the whales among the floes. And we steamed with kerosene lamps burning, an auxiliary engine for the fog and dead calms, and a try-works kept for rendering when necessary. The days that followed our departure were as many a northern hand would expect: a pale sun that rode low and took its time to warm the skin, white glare on reamed rigging, and the constant work of keeping a wooden hull clear of ice. We set topsails when the wind was fair and reefed them at the least complaint. The auxiliary engine, an old tow cylinder that coughed and answered with the stuttering authority of coal and piston, was our comfort in thin leads and heavy fog. In the binnacle, the compass swung steady when the irons settled the sextant and chronometer were handled with the care due to instruments that set one's life on a line of degrees. A man in the chart room kept pencils to hand. The captain pricked our course upon the chart with slow, patient fingers. There were small practicalities that kept a crew together: mending a frayed sheet by lantern light, checking a cask's bung for seepage, lashing the oars of a harpoon boat so she might be swung down at a moment's warning. The smell of kerosene and whale oil and tar was an almost perpetual cloud beneath the hatch. Men ate quickly, muttered over their porridge, spat and smoked pipes between watches. They slept in oilskins and rose with frost on their beards. The try-works, though used sparingly aloft, was always a thing to watch: a box of fire and pot that could make fortunes or failures. We kept its bellows dry and the irons ready. The ice changed as the days ran on. Leads opened and closed, floes grounded with a grinding toll, and the ship answered with a creak and a shiver that lived in the bones. Once we took a sounding with the lead line, 60 fathoms here, a sill of black water there, and marked our place. We were hunters, measure-minded men. We knew the signs of whale and of danger: spouts on a calm, a longitudinal crack in the ice, the sudden swarm of birds that announced an unseen shoal. All of these we could reckon. What followed, we could not. The first time any man named it aloud was the second night after a long spell of close pack. The sky closed to a lid of cloud, and the sea became a black mirror. I was on deck, checking the binnacle lamp and laying a hand upon the needle when the mate, a steady fellow named Pedersen, touched my sleeve and pointed aft. There, where a ship leaves its churned water, a shape had taken to following us. It was not foam, it carried no white and no froth. It was a long, low band of darker water, flat and unmoving in the way of an anchored shadow. When the wind rose, it did not break into spray. When the fog pressed down, it did not smell of the sea. It seemed to hang to our wake as if keeping station by its own will. The men guessed at first: an eddy, some submerged flow that had fallen in, the peculiar refraction of moonless clouds. The forward watch swore he had seen ribs under the surface, a running of pale arcs that moved in time with that dark trail, as though something vast rode below and kept pace with our keel. The captain paced the quarterdeck with the chart under his arm, fingers white upon its margin, measuring distance and calling for bearings. He ordered the boats readied and the guns cleared, not for sport, but for the business of caution. We changed course twice to test whether the thing followed our heading or merely our wake it followed. Night after night, the streak returned. The men spoke of it in low, clipped phrases, the old Greenland lore that some ships are followed by the sea's memory of them, or by a path that marks a strange favor or a strange doom. I wrote these things down with the calm of a man who knew the value of record, measuring to the quarter hour, noting latitude and wind, the puttering of the engine and the lookout's reports. Yet the instruments yielded nothing that satisfied us. Compasses true, chronometer steady, charts unchanged. What remained was a physical fact at the stern and the change in men's faces. They slept less, they ate less, they buttoned collars to the chin. As I closed the log that night, the kerosene lamp sputtered and the sea beyond the rail lay black and close. The dark band astern did not slacken. We steamed on into the floes, driven by the season and by the stubbornness that hauls men after whales. I knew then that our voyage, begun for trade and the taking of blubber, had been altered. A measured pursuit had become a watch. The air tightened with expectation, and the next day's sounding would tell whether our bearings continued to lead us into ordinary water, or into whatever thing had taken to following the Resolute's wake. The ice closed in like a living thing. Polinias opened and closed with the slow certainty of a breath. The aurora threw a thin green skin over the floes, and sea smoke hugged our rails at dawn, making the compass and chronometer our only certainties. The older hunters in Tromsø had muttered of following shadows, and of the Pomor tracks on the ice their stories had come with our coal and lines. A hushed council we treated politely until the swell altered their tone to something sharper. After that, every small occurrence took weight. We kept the chronometer in the chart room beneath oilcloth, and oh, clean handkerchief. I set the sextant against the binnacle each morning, while the mate, whose name was Larsen, and who had the blunt, tired face of men who had spent winters ashore trapping for seal, read aloud the barometer and the wind. We measured our latitude with a clean horizon and took noon sights when the sun would cooperate. Our log was ink on paper, course by compass, speed by the patent log, coals weighed in the bunkers, the number of rations remaining. Practical things, practical measures for an impractical place. At night, the ship creaked like an old throat, and the steam from the boilers made a silver veil about the mainmast. Men sat with coffee in their palms, or rolled tobacco into paper by the light of a kerosene lamp. The whaleboats were lashed to davits, the harpoons, and lines lay covered in tarpaulin. We kept a small firearm for polar bear and for the occasional smash of ice against timber. Nothing fanciful, but the locker contained an old carbine and a brace of pistols. We checked oil, tightened gaskets, mended canvas habit, not superstition. The first hint that there was more than distance and flow came one evening when the wind fell and the Polinias smoothed into glass. The lookouts reported at first the sound, a low dragging like rope over rock, repeating along the starboard quarter. I went to the rail and peered into the half-light. The sea at the edge of our wake steamed, and on the nearest floe there were marks, long parallel scars across the ice, fresh and black where the snow had been scraped away. They were not the marks of a sledge, nor of seals. The men said nothing for a time. Then one of the deckhands, a lad who had learned to read weather by the scar on his knuckle, whispered "Pomor" and folded his hands over his chest as if to keep a flame from going out. We followed those marks for 2 nights. They would appear at the mouth of a polynya and run down the ice like the track of some great thing that had slid from one floe to another, keeping pace with us as though it were watching our stern. Once, when the aurora came down like a curtain and the glow made the floes ghost white, we saw a shape at the edge of the light, a long shadow that rose and fell with the undulations of the ice, without the clean outline of man or beast. It left a residue of cold, as if the air itself had been shaved sharp where it passed. The older hunters' words began to acquire a grammar in our heads. They had said to mind the night, to mind the polynyas that open and close without notice. They had traced with a grubby finger the familiar Pomor tracks, and then looked away, as though the tracks might lead to something unnamed. We found in the mornings other things besides the scars. A coil of kelp caught in a cleat that had not been there the day before, a strip of canvas thread threaded through the chain dogs as if some hand had toyed with our fittings. Once, the mate found the outline of a boot on a floe, its heel pressed deep as if by a weight we could not place. We put no point to these objects with our words, we catalogued them. On the 3rd night, a man on watch called out more sharply. He had gone out to ease the mizzen, and near the gangway he saw what he swore was a figure moving along the edge of a floe, keeping the glare of our lights at its back so that it remained all contour and no feature. He cocked his lantern, and the thing slid beneath the rim of a polynya and was gone as if the sea had swallowed it. The mate seized the carbine and fired a single shot into the dark to startle whatever followed us. The report rolled across the ice like a distant gun from another age. Nothing answered but the falling of flakes. We deliberated then in low tones by the chart-room lamp. The captain, deliberate and plain-spoken, ordered that the men double their watches and that the boats be kept ready. He would not speak of monsters, he used weather terms and the word hazard. Yet when we turned our faces away from him, the men did not look at the polished brass of the compass or the neat columns of the log. They looked to the pack. By dawn, we had a new mark to follow. Not just the scarred ice, but a trail of small, odd impressions leading from one floe to another, forming a crooked line inland where the floes closed. It suggested a path taken more than once. We prepared to go ashore on the next clear morning, mending lines, storing spare provisions in the smaller skiff, assigning 3 to stay with the Resolute while the rest took the boats. We argued about prudence and duty before sleep found us, each man thinking of his family, his bread, and the stories the Tromsø men had told. I wrote these facts then, with the chronometer clicking beside my pen, because nothing in our instruments accounted for the scratches on the ice, the kelp in the cleats, or the way the aurora could make a thing appear and vanish as if it were a stillborn dream. We were bound to the morning, to the plan we would go ashore and follow where the tracks led. The men moved with the gravity of those who had seen a line and knew the need to see what lay at its end. On the 3rd night, the watchman, a wiry fellow named Elias, rapped at my cabin door before the 2nd bell and would not be put off. He had stood the starboard bow watch from midnight and had kept his eye on the shadow aft. What he reported was a persistent wake, a dark ribbon 50 yards astern that neither matched the revolution of our screw nor the drift of the surrounding floes. We went upon deck with the binnacle light low and the binnacle glass fogged with our breath. The ocean beyond the ice was black as iron, and the sky a broken sheet of cloud. There was no swell to speak of, only a slow, imperceptible movement of the pack. The wake lingered, separated from us by a temperate margin of water, then closed again as if choosing a new bearing. We exhausted the ordinary explanations. The chief engineer crawled beneath the counter to examine the screw when daylight gave him light. The engine room showed nothing untoward. No excess revolutions, no slack in the shaft. Our chronometer and radio had not the sort of instrument to measure such things, but the men knew the sound and feel of our machinery and swore it was not ours. The floes drifted with the current as any flow must, but their motion did not account for that straighter, deliberate seam of disturbed water. What followed in the morning removed doubt and left a different sort of dread. At first light, we cut a track to the nearest floe, lowering a boat under a thin sky and clambering upon the ice with rope in hand. Where the wake had lain, the floe bore deep furrows from stem to stern. They were not the random scratches of ridge pressure, but long, parallel gouges that ran full 10 feet and more into the ice. The towing iron, our heavy whaleboat hook, iron black from use, lay upon the edge of the floe where she had lodged against it. Its shank was rasped and blunted, the metal chafed as if by a great jaw. I set my hand upon it and felt the grooves like the teeth of some engine turned to stone. We heard then, first faint, and then, as if the vessel itself gave voice, a low thrum that ran through the hull. It came without warning and ended as abruptly. When I stood with both boots planted upon the deck, the sound was no mere noise, but a sensation that travelled under my soles. A vibratory note like distant surf, or a whale's song pitched an octave lower. Several of the men went from startled curiosity to a steady, practiced fear. The boatswain, Johnson, spat tobacco and made the sign of the cross beneath his breath. I pressed my ear to the timbers and felt the pulse as plainly as a man's heartbeat. Inspection revealed other mischief. One of our whaleboats had been torn free of its davits in the night. The hooks that should have held her had been bent. The blocks and falls showed the ragged teeth of violent strain. A coil of line, new fumigated rope taken for towing, was found shredded upon the rail, frayed to the inner cords in a way that spoke of repeated mastications rather than a single snap. There were no bloodstains upon the planking, no strewn blubber. The damage seemed interested rather than wanton, as if the unseen visitor had come to test and to taste the things by which we lived upon the sea. Captain Hargreaves ordered increased watches, and the men were set to lash every loose spar. We fitted chafing gear where we could, wrapped the davits in sailcloth, and bolted the boat hooks with extra manila. Yet none of that altered the quality of the nights. Men who had sailed since boyhood, menders of sails, men who had heard the spoken sound of baleen and seen the white of a whale's lip, moved about uncertainly. They traded glances by the lamp in the forecastle and spoke in lower tones. The carpenter sank his plane as if to catch his breath and said nothing when I asked him to make additional fastenings. That afternoon, we set the mates to heave sounding leads at odd intervals and to keep a lookout for anything like blow or fin. We fired a blank from the signal pistol at dusk to see if sound would startle the visitor away. The report carried thinly across the floes and brought men to the rail, but it changed nothing. The thrum returned in the small hours and was followed, as it had been the 2 preceding nights by that waking wake. It had the look of attention, the manner of something that came and lingered close enough to taste the ship's timbers. We could not tell whether the thing moved with hunger or with curiosity. It left the towing irons scored and one of our boats at drift, and it kept returning to the same place as if that patch of water were a meeting ground. The men began to mark the time between visits and to whisper theories that ranged from the natural, enormous walrus or rogue whale, to the uncanny. I made a note of the dates and times, of the appearance of the furrows and the feel of the vibration through the hull, and I watched the men. There is a silence that falls upon a crew when the sea offers up a thing it will not name. In that silence, we prepared for what the next night might bring. One lantern-lit watch, I saw it plainly. A long, sinuous shadow sliding alongside the Resolute, as broad as our beam and marked with dull phosphorescent patches. It moved without surfacing fully, a series of ridged undulations like ribs under dark water, and it answered our creaking hull with a low, resonant call that set the binnacle glass quivering. We steamed, we cast lines, and the men readied harpoons and steam up to full pressure, but the creature kept pace in the black, and, when it struck the stern with a force that threw splinters from the rail and bent the copper plating. The alarm ran like a current along the decks. Lantern glasses were screwed down, oil put to the troughs, and my fingers went at the binnacle for the compass that wavered beneath the tremor. The mate shouted for the pumps, and for every rope we had, our small boats were hauled inboard, the whalebone spars lashed. We had with us, as was ordinary in 1903, a steam-driven winch and a deck-mounted harpoon gun, the kind that fires the bomblets. She smoked like a foundry as the engineer crowded the blower's steam pressure, throbbing through pipes made the deck plates twitch beneath my boots. We could not at once bring gun to bear. The thing held to our quarter and rode the swell with us, its back tracing the sea like a dark keel. Each rise displayed those pale blotches that glowed as if from within. Men strained at the ropes, and when the mate gave the order, the gun spat a harpoon. The iron struck down into the water, and the line ran from the drum for a breath. We thought we had wound the creature, but the line paid away taut, and then grew slack, as if slackened by some enormous weight unseen. The harpoon had lodged, but did not hold. It was not a whale in any account I had read. There was no blow of steam, no familiar exhalation of breath. The sound it made, an undernote, measured and hollow, sent a rattle through the binnacle, through the glass of our lamps, and settled in a part of the ear where panic begins. I remember the steward crossing himself. The oldest seaman hummed some prayer under his breath, and then spat, more from habit than hope. The second strike came without warning. We were in the act of hauling, when the stern shuddered like the kick of a horse, and a shower of splinters stung the faces of those near the rail. Copper that had been recently corked, buckled in an angry curve oil, ran black into the scuppers. A lad, 2 watches from being a man, went overboard in the confusion. It happened too quick to relate cleanly, and we spent precious minutes beating the water with oars while the Resolute rolled, and the thing kept pace, indifferent to our flailing. Our boats came back empty. We had no hand upon that boy when the creature vanished into the dark as silently as it had arrived. The boy was not among the living the next day. What we pulled from the sea was a scrap of coat, a gloved hand. We set reefed canvas and pushed steam to her limits. There is little distinction between prudence and panic when a ship answers to its bearings with the life of her crew at stake. The captain ordered a course for open water away from the shoals we had skirted, and we ran with eyes like torches. Men took to checking chronometers and sextants, practical acts against fear, while others climbed to peer into the wet night with naked hands pressed to the shrouds to stop them trembling. We did not see the thing again that watch, though its call haunted the bell ropes and the timbers. We found the copper dented along 17 feet of her stern, and the carpenter counted the broken planks and marked them with a piece of chalk. In the days that followed, we took to double watches. The creak of the binnacle glass was a sound we learned to dread. Every unusual swell made men stand to with harpoons ready. We traded our sleep for sentries, checked the steam pressure until the engineer's fingers were sore, and logged bearings with a steadier hand than our hearts felt. Rumors spread among the men. Old wives' tales of polar serpents, Inuit stories whispered in hurried translation by our hired interpreter. But none of these eased the practical matters of a scorched stern and a missing lad, and a sea that had borne a shape no chart could hold. At noon, with the ice edge still dim upon the horizon, we made sail for the nearest anchorage and set aside tools to fit the stern with temporary plates. The matter was not a thing to be written away in a log and forgotten. It left a cadence in our voices, and when, months hence, men spoke of other voyages, they would lower their heads and say little. For my part, I recorded the sound of that call in the margin of every page thereafter, because some things will not be allowed to sleep, merely because we change course. The sea had answered our hull with a voice, and the ship kept its wake through black water as if something still ran alongside. We fought free at first light and doubled down for the open sea, but we lost a whaleboat and 2 shipmates to a sudden surge, names inked in the log and never crossed out, and returned to Tromsø with a battered stern, a failing try-works, and a crew muttered into a new silence. The hour before that morning remained with me as though carved on the wood of the Resolute. The deck slick with steam from the try-works, the acrid smell of blubber and coal that would not be driven off by the keen northerly wind, and the low, unceasing sound of water along the ship's flanks like a thing breathing. On the penultimate night, the ice had closed in as if to test us. Our binnacle showed no appreciable drift on the compass. The chronometer and sextant had been set and checked against the logbook at 3 bells. The sea, where it showed between floes, lay black and glassy. We had trimmed canvas to a whisper and let the Resolute ride the channels where ice permitted. I stood the dog watch with Reeve and the carpenter, hands thawing at a tin of hot tea, eyes on the wake. It was then that the wake betrayed us. Not a wake of ordinary wake, no froth from the stern or the narrow streak of light a ship leaves at sea, but a deeper furrow, a movement in the water that remained when we altered course. I marked the phenomenon plainly in the sketch I kept. A trailing line, broad and unbroken, as if another keel rode the darkness exactly where ours had cut. The men at the rail watched it, as they might watch a lantern on a distant rock. There was no jest then, no coarse whaleman's ridicule. I remember Jonas bending forward and saying, almost inaudible, that it followed our compass as if keen to keep us in sight. We tried to account for the thing with the tools of our trade. I had the lead line cast to sound for any change in current. The samples showed only depth and the cold blackness of Arctic water. We took wild oarings in a whaleboat to lay lines astern and test for eddy or surge. It answered by the sudden surge that tore our boat from our hands. No visible breaker, no pack of wind, but a heave from beneath that caught wood and man alike. 2 men vanished in that hour we searched till dawn with lanterns and rope, until the sea offered only bitter emptiness. Once free, when the light came and the ice loosened its hand, we sailed for open water. We doubled down, set every seam and scraped the ice from the rudder, because there remained the unmistakable impression that we had been followed. The try-works that had kept us afloat for weeks was fouled and would not hold a steady fire, the blubber would not render cleanly, and the oil casks sloshed with the chill of a sea that seemed to steal heat itself. The men moved about like men who had decided the world had shifted underfoot, mending canvas, splicing lines, tying knots with fingers swollen from cold and grief, their glances falling to the rail whenever the night came on. At Tromsø, the authorities measured our damage and wrote their reports. They called it misjudgment of ice, a failure of lookout, fatigue. They made the proper entries in duplicate and sent for drill and stores. Men in the tavern took the sketch from me and passed it about as if it were a curiosity from some colonial fable. I sold no tale that night. I set the sketch with the log and watched the faces of other skippers when they thought themselves alone. How each man would, without speaking, walk to the rail and look out toward the fjord as if to measure whether something else still kept the ship company. What I could record were particulars, the precise latitudes we held, the frayed hemp of the whale lines, the weight of canvas in my hands, the sound of the ship's timbers yielding to ice. I wrote how the watch smelled of oil and stale tobacco, how the carpenter's seam had bled a thin line of sap like a small promise of repair, how the men who had not gone down polished the brass in the cabin until the compass stared back at them. I wrote of the silence that was not simple sorrow, but a caution, an unwillingness to speak aloud, the sense that the sea kept counsel with something beyond our charts. We told our tale in many forms thereafter, to magistrates, to merchants, to old men in Tromsø who had ridden many Arctic winters. It made them shake their heads. Some laughed, some offered scripture, some offered explanation in the neat language of currents and tides. Yet the men who had watched the wake that summer never spoke of that night without returning to the rail. And whenever I set pen to paper to recount it, my hand would pause at the place where the line in my sketch terminates in the dark, and I would feel the ship's hull beneath me like a pulse. The question of what trailed the Resolute at night remained as stubborn as the Arctic ice, answered in no ledger, claimed by none, and it followed us in the way of small, terrible certainties into every crossing we later made.